Hello. Welcome to how to build your own virtualization server from scratch. Also, I introduce 3 ways of remote access. Let's get started. Here are the hard drives and a USB drive I used in this example. A solid-state drive to install the virtualized operating system. A traditional hard drive to create a network storage server. And a USB drive to create a bootable OS installer. I will do it step by step, so I only connect the solid-state drive to the computer. When it comes to creating a network storage server, I will connect the traditional hard drive later. I use another computer to create the virtualized operating system installer. In this case, I use Proxmox. This is a widely used solution and has a free version. You go to the home page and download the latest installer. After the download is complete, you use an application to write the image file to the USB drive. I use a familiar application called Rufus. This is the application, no installation required. You just run the executable, select the USB drive and browse to the file you just downloaded. The application automatically detects the image file for appropriate customizations. After a few minutes of waiting, you will have a bootable virtual operating system installer. I plug the USB drive into the target computer and start the installation step by step. On the target computer, I access the motherboard management page. On the management page, I change the boot order. I set the computer to boot from the USB drive. After completing the boot order setting, I save the changes and restart the computer. A Proxmox setup screen appears. I install using the graphical interface. The graphical interface is user-friendly for most people. You are asked to select the target hard drive. Because the computer has only one solid-state drive, I choose it. If I have a traditional hard drive connected, I have 2 options. Next, you are asked to create a new administrator password. You use this password to log into the server management page. If you have a complex password, I recommend you write it down. Next, you set up the domain name and IP address. You assign an unused IP address in the subnet you are using. Don't forget to set up the gateway address and the domain name resolution address to make sure it is connected to the internet. The gateway address is usually the router's IP address. The setup steps are very basic, including only time zone, language, admin password, IP address. Then you wait a few more minutes to complete the operating system installation. After completing the installation, the computer automatically restarts. To make sure the computer boots from the solid-state drive, I access the motherboard management page. Instead of booting from the USB drive, I set the computer to boot from the solid-state drive. I save the changes and restart. You wait until the login address appears on the screen. It includes the IP address and port of the virtualization server. These are the steps to install the system operating for the virtualization server. Now you can create virtual machines on it. To log into the server management page, I use another computer in the same internal network. On that computer, I open any browser and log into the management page using the server's IP address. Do you remember the admin password created when installing the operating system? You use it to log into the virtualization server management page. Next, I will introduce 3 ways of remote access. Besides that, I will create a new network storage server. Which of the following 3 ways will you choose? I start with the first way, which is remote access using port forwarding and dynamic domain name. My virtualization server is behind the router. So I log into the router and forward the port. You forward port 8006 to the IP address of the virtualization server. By default, the server has been assigned a static IP address. Next, I access the remote server using the public IP address. You can access the page managed from anywhere using public IP address. If you use static public IP address, then that is great because most people use dynamic public IP address. If you use dynamic public IP address, then you need dynamic domain name service. There are many options for you, but in this case I use a free solution. I use dynamic domain name service called DuckDNS. With this service I can create 5 free domains. I use Google account to create a free account. Then I create a new free domain. You will find IP address updates for your domain on different platforms. I will create a Linux virtual machine and use it to map IP address and domain. On the virtualization server, I download a template of Ubuntu operating system. This is a miniature of Ubuntu operating system. It helps me create virtual machines with small size and low hardware requirements. After downloading the template, I create a new machine virtual. I name the virtual machine and set a login password. You use this password to log in the next step. Next, you select the template that was just downloaded in the previous step. Then the hardware settings for the virtual machine. I leave it as default. You assign a static IP address to this virtual machine. You can use a dynamic IP address if you want. But I want to use a static IP address because I want to manage virtual machines scientifically. Then you wait a moment to create the virtual machine. Next, I start the virtual machine to update the IP address for my domain. I log into the virtual machine using the password created in the previous step. You follow the instructions on the home page of the dynamic domain service for your virtual machine. I create a new folder. In that folder, I create a new executable file. Next, you copy the text and paste it to the executable file. The text includes the domain name and the key of each account. You use the key combination to save the file and exit. Next, you create the executable file. Do you want to run the executable file on a schedule or run it manually? Of course, we schedule the executable file. It is tiring to run it manually. I schedule the executable file. It automatically checks the IP address public. If changed, it automatically updates. In this case, I want to use the domain name right now, so I run the executable manually. The update result will be written to the log file. The log file tells me whether the IP address update was successful or not. If the log file gives the above result, it is successful. If you get a different result, it means it failed, and you should review the contents of the executable, your domain name, or your secret key. With the dynamic domain service, I solved the dynamic public IP address problem. I access the server using the domain name. I access the virtual server using the domain name right on the local network. That does not guarantee that the above settings are correct. To test, I connect my computer to another wireless network. This network has a different public IP address than the public IP address the server uses. From another network, I connect to the server management page using the domain name. With this method, you can access the management page remote server but cannot directly access the virtual machines. Suppose on the virtualization server I have a network storage server, then with this method I cannot access the shared resources. For that reason I will introduce the second remote access method. I built a virtual private network using the virtualization server. I connect a traditional hard drive to the server. I use it to create a network storage server. On the management page you go to Manage Drives. You make sure the server has detected the traditional hard drive. I delete the old data on it and initialize it. Next I create a new volume using the traditional hard drive. You use this volume to create a network storage server or create a virtual machine as you like. This is how to expand the capacity of the virtualization server. You should use a solid-state hard drive to create a virtual machine to optimize performance. There are many applications that help you create a network storage server. In this case I use a simple and quick method. I update the server. Proxmox uses the above command. Next I go to Templates. In the drop-down list you choose a template to build a network storage server. This is an easy and quick solution to build a file server. From the newly downloaded template I build a file server. I create a new virtual machine, name it and set a password. This virtual machine is installed on a traditional hard drive to optimize storage capacity. Next I set up the IP address for the file server. I use an unused IP address. Then set up the gateway address, the domain name resolution address. After completing the file server creation I started to go to the initializations. You are asked to create an admin password. I use the basic features so I skip some advanced settings. Very quickly I have a file server. Next I access the management page with the provided link. You use the password set when creating the new file server to log in. Here are some basic steps to create a shared folder. I create a new account. I use this new account to access the shared folder. I do not use the administrator account for remote access because it is not safe for the system. After creating the new account, I convert it to use for shared resource access. I allow this account to use the file sharing service. Next, you create a new folder. This folder was created by the administrator account, so I change the ownership. I change the ownership from the administrator account to the account just created in the previous step. The owner account has full permissions to this folder: read, write, and execute. This folder was created but not shared, so I add it to the sharing service. I create a new shared folder. I browse to the newly created folder and share it over the network. You make sure to allow write permissions in the shared folder. These are the basic and quick steps to have a file server. Now I will test the result by accessing the shared folder using the IP address. You use the authorized account to access it. Access successful. I create a new file to ensure read and write permissions. But how to access this file server remotely? As mentioned, I build a VPN. In this case, I use wireguard. I need one more template. A template to create a VPN server. I download the template to create a wireguard server. To create a VPN server, I need a dynamic domain name and port forwarding on the router. I use the dynamic domain name service that was set up in the previous step. Because I use a dynamic public IP address, so I use a dynamic domain name. If you use a static public IP address, then skip it. Similar to the previous times, I use the template to create a VPN server. Set a name and password for the virtual machine. I create the virtual machine on a solid-state drive with the default size. Next, I assign a static IP address that is not used. Set the gateway address, the domain name, resolution address to ensure the virtual machine has an internet connection. On the router, you forward the port to the newly created virtual machine. The port is 51820. After completing the port forwarding, you start the virtual machine and start the initialization steps. With this template, you can easily create a VPN server without using complicated commands. I set this virtual machine as a VPN server and allow clients to connect to it. Next, I change the default subnet. This is the subnet for the VPN. Next, you fill in your dynamic domain. The dynamic domain is the destination of the clients you want to connect to. You can replace it with a static public IP address if you have one. Skip some other settings to the VPN management screen. I have completed creating the VPN server. To connect to this server, you create a new configuration file for the client. If you have multiple clients, you create different configuration files. I create a new configuration file for the client and route it to allow access to the internal network. After completion, you will receive a link to download the configuration file. You can use the domain name or IP address of the VPN server. I use the path to download the configuration file. The contents of the configuration file include the IP address, destination address, port, private key and public key. You use the configuration file on the client. I will use this computer as a client, so I install the wireguard software. You go to the home page and download the version for the client. After completing the installation, I add the configuration file. To test the result, I connect the computer to the shared wireless network from the phone. Next, I use the diagnostic tool to test the connection. On the computer, I set up a VPN connection from the client to the server. I can access the file server remotely. I can create a new file in the shared folder. You can access the virtual server just like in the local network. The diagnostic tool tells me that I have successfully connected to the server. This is the second method to remotely access the virtual server. This is the second method to remotely access the virtual server. This way secure but requires you to set up dynamic domain name and port forwarding on router. Is there a way to access remotely without port forwarding and dynamic domain name? The answer is yes. I will introduce that with the third method to remotely access virtual server. With this method I also use a VPN but do not need to build a server myself. I use a VPN service. I use tailscale service. For personal needs or few clients you can use the free version. I will remove the port forwarding on the router because I do not need them anymore. Next I create a new virtual machine. I use this virtual machine as a client of the VPN. On that virtual machine I route to allow remote access to the internal network. So I can access other virtual machines as well as access the virtualization server. You create a new virtual machine, set an unused IP address, set the gateway address, the domain name resolution address to ensure it is connected to the internet. I deploy the virtual machine and log into it using the password created when creating the new virtual machine. I recommend you update before installing the application. After completing the update, I install the VPN service. You will get the above error when trying to enable the service. To solve that problem, follow these steps. By default, this virtual machine is not allowed to create tunnels. This makes the system more secure. But I want to create a tunnel for other devices to connect remotely. So on the virtualization server, I edit the configuration file of the newly created virtual machine. Each virtual machine has a unique identifier. I only change the configuration of the virtual machine to install the virtual private network service application. I add 2 lines in the configuration file and save the changes. Next, open the command window of the virtual machine. On this virtual machine, you enable port forwarding. After completing, you restart the virtual machine to apply the changes. Now you enable the service. You will receive a login path and no error message. I use that path to add a new machine, a client. With this virtual private network service, I use a Google account to create a new virtual private network. After completing the login, you will see a new node. That is the virtual machine on the virtualization server. There is another custom number on the virtual machine. I disable the virtual private network service. Then enable it with additional parameters. The additional parameters help the traffic going through the virtual machine to the local network. You will see that this node has different features than the other nodes. On the virtual private network management page, you enable routing. You set up the node as above to allow computers or phones to access the local network remotely. It's time to check the results. As you can see, I don't use a dynamic domain name, and port forwarding on the router can still create a virtual private network. On this computer, I download the client application. After completing the installation, you add this computer to the virtual private network just created in the previous step. The virtual private network has two nodes. One is the virtualization server, the other is the computer I am using. I recommend you rename the nodes to make it easier to manage them. Similarly, the previous 2 times I connected to another wireless network to check the results. Here are the steps to build a virtualization server and the ways remote access. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Of course, with virtualization server you can build more things. But with the above basic steps, I hope you have the best familiar steps. Good luck. With the above virtual private network service, you can not only access the virtualization server management page but also access the virtual machines on it. As you can see, I can access the shared folder and create a new file on it. It's great that you're still watching this far. Thank you so much.